The sky was the color of a day-old bruise, and it was the last thing they saw before the world turned to fire. The first volley didn't come as a whistle or a cry, but as a deep, guttural thump that vibrated through the stone, rattling the teeth in their skulls. 1,000 flaming arrows arced over the battlements, not to kill, but to blind. They struck the wooden hoardings, the rooftops, the straw strewn across the courtyard, and the night erupted into a hellish, flickering day. Inside the walls, there were only 500 men left who could still hold a blade. 500. Outside, the army stretched from the tree line to the distant river, a seething mass of steel and leather that blotted out the horizon. They knew their numbers, they knew their strength, and they knew, with a certainty that sat in their stomachs like a stone, that they should not be alive to see the sunrise. The first wave came not with ladders, but with a terrifying, thunderous crash. A massive battering ram, its head sheathed in black iron, rolled forward from the enemy camp. It was a beast of a thing, pulled by 100 men, its iron-shod wheels carving deep furrows into the churned mud. It didn't aim for the main gate. That was the obvious point, the expected point. It was a feint, a diversion for the thousands of soldiers who were now sprinting toward the walls with grapnels and scaling ladders. The defenders, the 500, didn't panic. They couldn't afford to. They had no reserves to call upon, no cavalry to sally forth. They had only the stone beneath their feet and the darkness of their own making. They didn't try to stop the ram. They let it come. They let it grind its way to the reinforced postern gate, a smaller entrance on the less defended eastern side. The enemy commanders, watching from their distant command post, must have smiled. They had found the weak point. The men on the ram heaved, the heavy timber striking the old oak door with a sound like a giant's fist. It shuddered, but held. Then came the scream. Not a war cry, but a sound of pure liquid terror. It came from above, as the first of a dozen massive stone cauldrons, hidden behind a false parapet, was tipped. The contents weren't burning oil. That was too precious. Instead, a deluge of quicklime, a fine white powder so caustic it could eat through leather and burn the flesh from bone, descended upon the soldiers clustered around the ram. In the same instant, a second wave of defenders tipped barrels of water. The lime and water mixed, creating a scalding chemical reaction. It wasn't a fire. It was worse. It was a searing, blinding fog that choked the lungs and turned the ram's crew into shrieking, flailing figures, their armor useless against a poison that sought their eyes and throats. The mighty ram fell silent, abandoned as its operators stumbled blindly away, their siege broken by a schoolmaster's recipe, but they had only bought minutes. The enemy adapted. A second wave came, not with a ram, but with their dead. They used their own fallen as shields, hoisting bodies onto long poles to absorb the next volley of arrows. It was a cold, brutal pragmatism that would have broken a lesser garrison. But the 500 were already living in a nightmare. They had already seen their friends die. A young defender, a boy barely old enough to shave, saw a friend's face used as a pincushion and almost faltered. But an old soldier, a veteran who'd lost his shield arm in a battle long forgotten, pushed him back to the wall. "They are giving us targets," the veteran growled, his eyes hollow. "Do not be merciful. Be efficient." The 500 knew their only chance was to bleed the enemy dry, to make the cost of taking these walls so terrifyingly high that the invading army might simply decide it wasn't worth it. They poured not boiling oil, but flaming pitch, thick and tar-like, which stuck to armor and flesh, creating human torches that stumbled back into the massed ranks, spreading fire and panic. They didn't aim at the men with the ladders, but at the men behind them, the officers, the standard-bearers, the core of the attackers. They were trying to sever the head of the snake from the body, to create confusion, to make orders impossible. Still, the enemy broke through. They made it onto the walls. A section of the battlement in the northwest corner was overwhelmed. A dozen armored warriors, huge men with long axes, hacked their way onto the parapet. They created a beachhead. It was the moment the defenders had feared most. If the attackers gained a foothold, the 500 would be overwhelmed in a matter of minutes. But this was the moment for which the defenders had prepared their final desperate gambit. They had filled the base of the walls with dry tinder, brush and straw for days. They had told no one but their most trusted. As the enemy surged onto the walkway, a signal was given. A torch was cast from the central tower, not at the attackers, but down into the ditch below. The fire exploded with a roar, a wall of bright, hungry flame that licked the side of the stone. The armor of the enemy soldiers, their metal greaves and hauberks, began to heat and burn them. They were trapped on the wall, a ribbon of stone between the defenders' swords on one side and the inferno on the other. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was a furnace. Those who weren't consumed by the flames were cut down as they tried to flee, their discipline utterly shattered. The enemy retreated again. The fire subsided into a thick, choking smoke that hung over the battlefield, a shroud of death and despair. Inside, the defenders took stock. They were less than 400 now. They had lost a quarter of their men in that single assault. The ones who were left were wounded, exhausted, their eyes glazed with shock and trauma. They had nothing left to burn. Their arrows were spent, their oil was gone. The enemy had taken the ditch and was regrouping just out of bowshot. There was no more clever trick, no more hidden cauldron, no more secret flame. They had nothing but the stone walls and their own broken bodies. They looked at the remnant of their army, the village blacksmiths, the farmers, the old men, the young boys, all standing shoulder to shoulder in the torchlit courtyard. They knew they could not repel another assault. They knew the next charge would be the last. In the distance, they could see the enemy forming up. The drumming began again, a low, insistent heartbeat of doom. The sound of it was louder now, more confident, a victory march before the end. A herald walked out from the enemy lines, carrying a white flag. For a moment, a sliver of hope sparked in the hearts of the defenders. The herald demanded their surrender. He offered them a choice: leave with their lives or be put to the sword when his masters finally took the walls. The commander looked at his men. He could see the weariness, the fear. He could also see their resolve. They knew what would happen to the women and children they had sent to the caves below the castle. The enemy would find them anyway. This offer was a lie, a trick to make them open the gates. The commander didn't say a word. He simply drew his sword, the one his father had used, and pointed it at the waiting army. The herald, seeing the gesture, spat on the ground and walked back to his lines. The hope was gone, replaced by a grim, cold acceptance. There were no more heroics. There was only the end. The sun had risen by the time the final assault began. It cast long, ragged shadows across the field, illuminating the army's full, terrifying splendor. Their war drums were joined by trumpets and the brutal shrieking of 1,000 horns. The ground shook with the tread of their march. They came with a new machine, a massive siege tower built of green timber, covered in wet hides, its sides bristling with spikes and swords. It was a mobile fortress designed to overtop their walls and disgorge 100 soldiers directly into the courtyard. The defenders took their last positions. The veteran with the missing arm stood on the steps of the main keep, barking orders that no one could hear over the din. The boy with the hollowed face took a pike and aimed it at the approaching tower. They were going to die. He knew it. They all knew it. The moment they had dreaded, the moment they had fought for 2 days to prevent, was here. The tower shuddered to a halt against the wall, and with a crash, the drawbridge slammed down, forming a gangplank of death. The first of the enemy charged across. A huge man wearing a great helm, his axes held high. The defender with the pike stepped forward and lunged, but he was too slow. The axe caught him in the shoulder, cleaving through his armor and dropping him in a heap. The rest of the defenders met the invaders head-on, a ragged line of desperation against a flood of steel. There was no more strategy, no more tricks, just men killing men. The veteran with one arm smashed his sword against the visor of a charging soldier, sending him reeling, but another was already there, stabbing him in the ribs. He fell, gasping, as the enemy swarmed over him.
And then something happened. A strange sound, a horn, but not one from the enemy camp. It came from the hills behind them. Then another, and another. The enemy soldiers on the wall stopped, looking behind them in confusion. Their charge faltered. The defenders, those who were still on their feet, looked up from the carnage. The enemy was pulling back. They were streaming back down the walls, abandoning their positions, scrambling in a panic. The commander, blood pouring from a wound in his scalp, crawled to a gap in the crumbling stone. He looked out, and his heart stopped. A new army was on the horizon. Banners he didn't recognize, but that clearly weren't the enemy's, were marching down from the passes. They were moving fast, their banners glittering in the dawn light. They were reinforcements, not just for them, but a rival host, a third power whose scouts had finally found the battle.
The enemy commanders in the field were screaming orders, desperately trying to reform their lines to meet this new threat. The defenders watched as the invading army, the one that had been a sea of steel just moments before, was caught in the open, its flanks exposed, its siege equipment turned to useless lumber. They had held. They hadn't won, but they had held long enough. In the courtyard, the survivors stood among the dead. The boy with the pike was gone. The veteran was dead. Half of the 500 were gone, but the rest were standing. They were battered, burned and broken, but they were alive. As the dawn fully broke over the shattered walls, they listened to the shouts and clatter of the new army engaging the enemy. They had walked into the abyss, and the abyss had blinked first. They had used the stones, the fire, the lime and the earth, not just to fight, but to buy the one thing the enemy could never have foreseen: time.